If we figure out how to turn the lights on at some point, they will go on. But yeah, welcome everybody. My name is Patrick Ayers. I'm the New York organizer for Socialist Alternatives, and I really want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I want to thank our two speakers, and I definitely want to thank Democratic Socialists of America who are co-sponsoring the meeting tonight. Amelia, to my left, will be co-moderating tonight's event. And so we have called this meeting Socialists and the Resistance, which is really a bad title, but it fits really nicely on a Facebook title line with our two speakers' names. So that's how we ended up with the title. But, you know, some really dramatic events have taken place in the last 4 months, and U.S. politics have really changed dramatically. We have one of the most right-wing administrations we've seen in a very long time. It's moved very aggressively. It's a very dangerous threat to women, to immigrants, to workers' rights. We've also seen, on the other side, some of the biggest demonstrations in many years, and including today. There are tens of thousands of people marching for science, which I think is really, really great. And those demonstrations have, in part, contributed to at least partially stopping some parts of Trump's agenda. Although I think, you know, we would be fools not to recognize that his administration is still a big threat, especially with, you know, the increased military maneuvers that are being carried out, bombing of Syria, etc. Another feature I feel like that's really important is also just the growing anger at the political establishment and the Democratic Party establishment. The growing frustration that's out there. And Bernie Sanders continues to be the most popular politician in the U.S., which is quite significant given the politics that he stands for. And we've also seen, of course, thousands of people in the U.S., young people in particular, looking for ways to get active, to get involved in a more meaningful way, many of them joining the socialist movement. That's the situation. And the question, I guess, for this meeting is how can the socialist movement, which is, you know, still quite small, growing quite rapidly, I think, which is really great, but how can the socialist movement kind of play a role in helping push struggles forward and helping push the resistance forward, not just defensive struggles, but of course also, especially in deep blue cities, in areas like New York City and Seattle, how can we help push forward offensive struggles? So I'm going to let Amelia introduce our first speaker in a second, but I just wanted to go over a little bit about the format for the meeting tonight. Each speaker is going to get 15 minutes to give an introduction. And then we have some prepared questions that me and Amelia prepared. And we'll take about 30 minutes to go through as many of those as we can. And then there will be about 20 minutes for questions for the audience. And then at the very end, Kshama and Bashkar will get to ask each other a question. So that should be cool. And there is beer and wine available in the back for a donation. If people can donate to help us pay for the room, that's really great. The bar is actually a fundraiser for Socialist Alternative members who are trying to get to an activist training. And I think that's all the logistics that we need to go over. Okay, bathrooms are over there, by the way, and they're not accessible for ADA people, unfortunately. Okay.
So thank you for that wonderful introduction. So, volume up.
Talk louder.
That's as far as.
Would projecting be good? Yeah, I can just project. Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. So, Bashkar Sunkara is the founder and editor of Jacobin, a socialist magazine whose circulation has now surpassed 30,000, and which has 1 million page views in a month. Bashkar has appeared on MSNBC, PBS, and FX to spread the good word of socialism, and is a vice chair of Democratic Socialists of America. He lives in New York. Off to you.
Oh, okay. Thank you all for coming. I don't think this is really much. Let's see if I can sustain this for like 15 minutes. I normally we do events here like once every 2-3 months, and there's probably about a third of the people that are here, showing up for those. So I know you're not here for me, so I'll be short. So I guess I guess there's good news and there's bad news about the current situation. The good news is that Trump doesn't have a real mandate yet. The bad news is that he could develop one. I think we can easily imagine a terrible, dangerous alternative future where Trump takes his kind of mix right now, Bannonite kind of populist rhetoric, extolling working America, and combines it with policies that seems to people to actually reflect at least the interests of some of that working class. Instead, he's combining that rhetoric with Paul Ryan's economic agenda with things that are just like nakedly contradictory to a lot of his stances and rhetoric and whatnot. But you can imagine also even an alternative scenario where the two wings of the Republican Party reconcile themselves, where maybe the Paul Ryan wing of the party says, maybe a compromise is instead of just doing Bannon's big infrastructure plan and through deficit financing and all public financing, maybe we do it through public-private partnerships and things like that. Things that reconcile the interests of these seemingly, contradictory parts of the Republican Party. And then, of course, you can also imagine a scenario where you have a candidate kind of like Trump, but not as gap-prone. So you can imagine if the Democrats couldn't defeat someone like Trump, who it seemed like through certain stretches of the campaign was doing everything possible to undermine himself, how they would act if we had a kind of a more polished and even potentially more dangerous version of Donald Trump. And in 2024, let's say, a American Le Pen, Marine Le Pen. The father's maybe a little bit closer to Trump. But I think the also pressing danger ahead of us is that the Clinton opposition can't stop losing, and they can't stop kind of falling down the same paths as before. The main lesson of the campaign seems to have been lost. You hear Democrats again and again. The more recent quote was the kind of Panera Bread circuit, where they want to win over the Panera Breads of America. So basically saying, wealthy suburbs and people who go to Panera Bread. I don't even know. I really knew what Panera Bread was, and it wasn't because I'm a man of the people. It was because I just assumed it was still Toasty or whatever. I don't get out much. So it's a new brand, I guess. But anyway, it bodes very poorly. The strategy. I can't speak to Panera Bread. So the Democrats seems to me, are just doubling down on this kind of uneasy marriage between kind of the rhetoric of social inclusion with the practice of neoliberal economics. So we're in a situation where we have a discredited liberal center, a dangerous right, but one that's still consolidating and still getting coherent and doesn't really have a mandate. We shouldn't forget that Trump was the distant third choice for American workers behind not voting and voting for Hillary Clinton, and 3, a emerging left that still is unfortunately marginal. So I look at this situation, and obviously being a reformist myself, I say thank God for Bernie Sanders, and I say that just because of Bernie Sanders, we have a viable alternative vision in American politics. It isn't necessarily our vision, but it is a vision that has attracted the support of millions of people. It's a vision that's now made Bernie Sanders the most popular politician in the United States, and it shows us that this kind of vision of social democratic politics, but social democratic politics won not through elite level negotiations, but through confrontation with capital, or as Sanders puts it, the millionaires and billionaire class, is a politics that can win a social majority in the United States. not 10 years from now, not 20 years from now, but right now and here and now. And to a certain extent, I feel like if it was our mission to enact that sort of, at the very least, left social democratic vision of the United States, we have a better starting point than, let's say, the job of Steve Bannon to build a majoritarian politics around ethno-nationalist politics in the United States. So, I mean, the caveat, of course, is that actually enacting even social democratic reforms in the United States is going to be almost impossible to imagine, even if electing a left populist is possible to imagine. But we can kind of get into that later. I would say that the current situation kind of lends itself potentially to this kind of return of an almost like neo-pop frontist rhetoric. So Popular Front, the idea that we just need to band together with all forces to the left of Donald Trump and just get Trump out of office before we do any other politics. And I think that's a really dangerous vision. You know, it's a kind of vision that has made George W. Bush kind of had a little, comeback the last couple of months. And I respect him, as a painter, but as, but in no way should he be, part of this burgeoning, resistance. But not even George W. Bush, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, this whole center of American politics, the center of the Democratic Party, has discredited itself. And if we want to defeat Trump in the long run, not just to score points or because we're angry about the election or whatever else, but if we want to defeat Trump in the long run, defeat Trumpism in the long run, we need to focus much of our energy on dislodging this center, on challenging their ideas, and make sure that there's actually lessons learned from the last election and there's progress. And we're able to present a kind of vision of left politics, a vision that could actually combat the populist right, because otherwise we'll be ceding anti-establishment politics to the populist right. And we've seen the dangers of that everywhere in Europe and so on, when the left has capitulated to the frameworks of things like the European Union, or in the U.S., things like the dominant kind of trade architecture and whatnot. It's left the populist right as the only people making those arguments, the only people speaking to anger. Trump's line throughout the whole campaign, "Make America Great Again," did capture people's views of kind of trying to build a future that was better than what they were living in today. And obviously it was tinged with, racism. It was openly xenophobic and so on. But in many ways, it's closer to speaking to people's anger than Clinton's, America's already great rhetoric. I think obviously our line is we should make America great, full stop. Now, I should say as far as the actual left, I mean, a lot of attention has been paid recently to the growth, obviously, of DSA, the continued growth of groups like Social Alternative. I think we shouldn't underestimate obviously, Jacobin's growth, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which a lot of this is kind of a media event, or not necessarily representative of broader changes or a sustainable shift in American politics. All of that's to say is that we're recruiting people, and I say we as in the general radical left, in ones and twos. We still don't have a very deep social base. Many of us come from working class backgrounds, but the left isn't really embedded in working class communities. And I think the distinction needs to be kind of clear. Mm-hmm. So in other words, when we talk often about the left or the socialist left, it's very telling that we're talking about the socialist left, and then we're also talking about social movements, and then we're also talking about broadly the labor movement or the workers' movement writ large. Mm-hmm. And the times in history where the left has actually been able to impact American society or world, or change actually the structures of any society anywhere around the world, it's been because this kind of division wasn't there. It's not a mental division, but it's just a structural fact of our organizing. So in other words, there was in the 1890s in Germany, there was just the workers' movement, and out of this workers' movement emerged a socialist leadership and socialist organizations, and out of that emerged day-to-day struggles for reforms and pitched battles and so on which would be modern day social movements and whatnot, but it was all part of a coherent and organic movement. So obviously, where does that leave us? I think there's one kind of way to look at it, which is just to kind of look around and say, all right, the left is disproportionately college educated. The left is disproportionately this, disproportionately that, and then kind of fall into either a defeatist mindset or a kind of mindset that's just entirely inward looking. So we're kind of having meetings to decide when the next meeting is and whatnot. I think that's obviously the wrong approach. What is the correct approach? I don't know. I just kind of I just edit a publication. I get to write and edit pieces about the rise and fall of Esperanto. Which is, I keep abstract because of these questions. But I think at the very least it requires putting on the horizon the fact that we're not implanted the way we should be implanted in working class communities, and we should be more implanted. And we do that through looking around and engaging in certain struggles, not just the low-hanging fruit on campuses and whatnot, but looking at there's already huge networks in this country of worker centers. There's already networks of immigrant centers. What would it take to get socialists more involved in those efforts, to expand, develop them, and push them to make them more class conscious and whatnot? I think DSA, at least in New York, is doing some great efforts around the Crown Heights Tenants Union and things like that I think is exactly the model for what socialists should be doing. I think obviously Social Alternative has managed to do electoral work that isn't seeing electoral work as an end in itself, but it's electoral work as a jumping point to actually do political education and raise political consciousness. So when socialists used to be in Parliament, in the peak of the socialist movement, which was from a very long time ago, I think. My peak is 1890 to 1913. We did so with the mode of kind of pure opposition, voting against bourgeois budgets, telling people how the system worked against them, using the platform to actually serve political ends and not as an end in itself. So how do we do that? On certain questions, I think we'll disagree, and I'll end on probably a point where I'm sure there is disagreement in the room. When I think about what platform we should use for pushing these socialist ideas, again, not to win electoral office just for the sake of legislating reforms, even if that might be desirable, and of course that's one end, but to push this opposition, to raise class consciousness and push socialist politics, I think about the need to actually build independent political action. Now, in the U.S. system, we're especially in places like New York, places elsewhere and across the country, which are dominated by one or two party politics, I think it's very difficult to say that socialists should devote our time to just building our own independent ballot line. I think that we could actually pursue independent political action through a combination of independent ballot lines when they're available or it's feasible, through running in primaries of the Democratic Party or even potentially in the Republican Party, as long as we meet a few prerequisites. As long as we have our own independent basis of funding, as long as we're running as open socialists, as long as we're accountable to a broader socialist organization. So again, I'm not proposing anything radical or anything as a departure. I am proposing that on certain issues, when we have these socialist candidates, these candidates will be able to vote freely as individuals to argue those positions. On other issues, I think they should be voting in bloc. It sounds like some crazy Leninist plot, but it's just basically the way any parliamentary formation works in any country with that kind of system. So in other words, I think that we'd be creating essentially the first party in the United States, even if by virtue, by the freak accident of having our electoral system, we're forced to do it through the means at times of other primaries of other parties. So I guess I left on the controversial and potentially dubious point. I didn't really have a conclusion. I thought in the course of explaining that I didn't have a conclusion for 15 seconds, I'd be able to come up with a pithy way to end, but I have not. So I'll just pass it along.
That was good. Okay.
Next up, we have from Seattle, our Socialist City Council member who was elected first in 2013 and then recently re-elected in 2015. It's well known she helped win the first major, or the first $15 minimum wage in a major U.S. city. But what might not be known here is that in February, Bill de Blasio made a comment that he had Seattle envy after Seattle passed legislation divesting $3 billion from Wells Fargo in solidarity with and of course, what wasn't mentioned was that Kshama moved that legislation on behalf of indigenous activists in the movement. So let me introduce Kshama Sawant.
All right.
Thanks everyone for including doing this discussion, and thanks to Socialist Alternative and the Socialists of America for convening this meeting, and thanks to Bashkar for very enlightening talk, and I'm sure our discussions will be ongoing, and I hope they will be ongoing. But I just wanted to start by recognizing, as other speakers already have done, that we really are in a critical moment in world history. And one of the most striking aspects of today, indeed the most defining feature of today, is the deep crisis that the ruling classes are in globally, but especially strikingly in the United States and Europe. You can see that globally capitalism is at an impasse, and while even in the best days of capitalism, days that some people, older people, are nostalgic for, even in those days, the gains that were shared with any section of the working class were still moderate. I would say that's why we are actually talking about a fundamental transformation away from capitalism. But today, capitalism has moved to even worse phase, a predatory phase, so to say, where for a whole generation of young people, many of whom are actually in this room, the idea of an American dream, or their little piece of the American dream, is simply not translating into reality. And that divergence between what we're told to expect as young people and what we actually get has a lot to do with why young people are thinking so furiously about not wanting to accept the status quo and being open to something different. And there you see all the polls of openness to socialism, even in the United States, which historically has been the belly of the capitalist piece. And I agree with Bashkar that I don't think that socialism is there's only any hardened or clear understanding of what socialism is in people's minds. But what's important to recognize now is that there is a huge opening for socialism. Young people are open, and I think that's key. And part of what's happening is that the recovery from the massive financial collapse has been so unstable for most of us. And the election of Trump himself is, in some ways, politically a culmination of this predatory phase. And I think Bashkar made a good point. I mean, what does it take to defeat somebody like Donald Trump? And the failures of the Democratic Party establishment in running Hillary Clinton are just unfortunately shining through in the way the campaign was run. I'll just mention that just a few days ago, Matt Taibbi, this brilliant writer, he wrote in Rolling Stone, in the latest issue of Rolling Stone, a review of a new book called Shattered, which is really an account of all the Clinton campaigners, Clinton campaign staff, and it's just incredible. It's amazing. The most overwhelming and fundamental problem that the campaign staff had in Clinton's campaign was not knowing what she was running for. We didn't know. They said we didn't know what she was running for. And compare that to the echo that Bernie Sanders got, that has already been talked about. But it's not just in the United States that you see the established ruling parties being completely and utterly discredited in the eyes of young people, and then seemingly weird things happening. Sanders getting an echo, Trump getting an echo, Same thing is happening in France. I mean, not exactly the same, but similar things. You see Marine Le Pen that Bashkar mentioned. She is her rise has terrified the ruling class because the ruling class doesn't want far right to rise because it is a reflection of the instability in their system. But so is the incredible rise of Mélenchon. I mean, it came seemingly out of nowhere, but it makes sense to us as socialists why he's experiencing a rise. And this is terrifying to the ruling class in Europe, both Marine Le Pen and Mélenchon. And so what we're seeing is a whole new generation across, on both sides of the Atlantic, determined to fight against the ruling classes. In the U.S., a new generation determined to fight against Trump, that a generation that finds his rhetoric xenophobic and racist and misogynist and anti-LGBTQ rhetoric stomach-turning and really is burning to do something. And so I think it'll be good for us to draw out some lessons. It's coming close to 100 days of Trump's administration, and I think Patrick made an important point that already we're seeing a change. I mean, when Trump was first elected, there was this whole, and there still should be a fear that, oh my God, a veritable monster has been elected. But there's a little bit of a change, and this is a very important change that we're seeing, which is based on the actual defeats that our movement and the current prevailing mood has been able to deliver. And a very important example of the defeat was the defeat of the Muslim travel ban. And I know many of you must have been at JFK Airport. In Seattle, we shut down SeaTac Airport. And my understanding is that that was the only airport that was fully shut down for several hours in Seattle. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. But I also wanted to recognize the strategic importance of the JFK shutdown, the action taken by the Taxi Workers Alliance, Delete Uber. I mean, all of this showed that even in a matter of minutes or hours, we could build a somewhat organized mass resistance against Trump. And that was fully played out in the SeaTac action at SeaTac International Airport near Seattle. We were there, socialists were there, and we were there for a period of 6 to 7 hours, and we led the whole action. We initiated the mass civil disobedience. We initiated and discussed the tactics of the shutdown, all in a matter of minutes. We politically motivated and walked the people through on how to do civil disobedience for the first time. It was like a live lesson, civil disobedience 101 for a lot of people who were there. These were not seasoned activists. These were people we had never seen before who came there just because they found the idea of a Muslim ban or banning any human beings absolutely unacceptable. And while the airport actions were smaller than the massive protests and marches on the women's marches on January 21st, the civil disobedience that happened, that forced the government to back down on the Muslim ban in some ways is politically more significant because it shows a real-life example of how we can organize a struggle and really force a powerful administration to accept a stinging defeat. The same thing, but in slightly different ways, happened with the defeat of Trump Care. There was definitely a movement around it, but primarily it was the mood of revolt that pushed back. I mean, look at the town hall after town hall of these Republican Congress members that ordinary people, many of them Trump voters and Republican voters went to, and they were so angry at the idea of losing the gains from the Affordable Care Act that the Congress members were no longer able to face them, and they started absconding. They started running away from these town halls because they couldn't face the angry masses. And so it's important for us to analyze where the Trump administration is, and Bhaskar touched on this. It's an administration in crisis. One of the very key examples of the crisis is the pushback on the arch-racist Steve Bannon, and I think he's not only been beaten back and has his influence declined, but he may also well be on his way out very soon. I mean, it's too soon to tell, but it seems like that might actually be happening. And you're seeing this shift from Trump, the right populist who got the votes on the basis of being a right populist, now moving towards more establishment-oriented agenda. And we'll be clear. I mean, we'll recognize this because it's important to recognize the terrain accurately as it's changing. But we also have to recognize that that doesn't mean that he is any less destructive or monstrous than he was before. It's not that he has had a change of heart on his ideas of misogyny or sexual violence or racism or hatred of immigrants. But the flip-flopping that you see from him is an indication of his own crisis. He doesn't want to lose, and he's now, flailing. And so, the Syria was mentioned, his foreign attacks are an example of an administration that is trying to cling to something. But you have to remember, it is still not what you would call a normal regime under U.S. capitalism. It is very much a reactionary regime. It's unstable, and it is still incredibly dangerous. We have no way of saying that the anti-immigrant attacks are going to stop. We have no way of saying that the attacks on women, attacks on Planned Parenthood, on reproductive rights are going to stop. And the same goes for the environment. And so it's no surprise that today the March for Science marches all over the country were, brought out tens of thousands. I heard that Fox News was reporting that Chicago had 40,000 people there, and and tens of thousands around the country. And I think there were more than 500 cities around the world that saw these marches. I mean, we think that these are just the beginning of the attacks that Trump and the Republican Party can do. And it's important to remember that when they say, when Trump moves from being a very extreme right-wing populist to closer to Republican establishment agenda, that is not benign in any way. It simply represents business as usual under capitalism. But what is that business as usual? It is aggressive imperialist bombing to distract from troubles at home. It means using military attacks to recast Trump as a strong commander-in-chief. Business as usual equals austerity capitalism that wants to destroy the very fabric of society, like public education and other basic gains that we have won from previous movements. Business as usual under capitalism means 8 people owning more wealth than 3.6 billion people of the world, more than half the population of the world. And so we have to be very clear that this is in no way a less dangerous regime. And that is why now that the March for Science are done, May Day is very important. It's just 9 days away, and it will be crucial for an ongoing reawakening of the American working class and American young people. And very importantly in this discussion is the reemergence of the question of strike action. And I know a lot of people are talking about it in terms of general strike. I would not call it a general strike. However, I don't think the most important point is to quibble on the terminology. The most important point is that strike action is back on the table. The question of going on strike and the thinking about the potential power that lies in the hands of working people if we, as a collective, consolidated, organized body, were to shut down the profit-making machine. What could that do? The opening up of that question is what's important, and that's why I think we should all be quite committed from now until May 1st, until May Day, to really build for May Day, and then on May Day, raising the question of how to build a summer of resistance of working people, but not just at workplaces, but also of students on university campuses and high school campuses and so on. And what is the kind of movement we're going to be talking about? It is important to talk about being defiant and really building organized resistance, but what kind of organized resistance are we talking about? We're not talking about this in the abstract, right? We're talking about in real life, what would this resistance have to look like? This resistance would have to be capable. These movements have to be capable to be sustained over months, years. They would need to be capable to inspire new people into the struggle, actively into the struggle. They would need to be capable to not only defend against and beat back on the attacks on our existing lives, but we also need to go on the offensive and fight for single-payer healthcare, fight for full funding of public education, all those sorts of things. We're not going to inspire a whole generation on a very limited vision of, let's protect what little we have. No, that's not what's going to get people out. I mean, in fact, if you see the conversation, the political conversation around the fight against Trump care, what got people out was the hope that we could finally build a movement for single-payer healthcare. And I can personally attest to you, I've talked to more people about single-payer healthcare in the last week and a half than I have in the last 5 years combined, because people are now starting to think maybe this is an opening for us to fight for something that we want, as opposed to just simply hunkering down and trying to protect what we already have. And so I think if we are going to talk about what kind of movement we want, then it also behooves the question of what would it take to win those demands. It would take fundamentally for this movement to not subject itself to the limitations and the discipline that corporate democratic politicians will place on us. In other words, this movement will have to develop independently, and its trajectory will have to be decided on what will be needed to win those victories. And I think automatically, when the question is posed in that way, it will put front and center the question of how do we orient ourselves to corporate politicians, and the fact that we will have to be unbending on that question will come to the fore. That it's not. I mean, I think in the Q&A, I hope we'll draw out more of the question of which party and so on, and I won't get into that right now. But I think just fundamentally, if we can first, as a starting point, think about this as what is the need of these social movements today in order to win victories and to move society in a different direction. And if we pose it that way, it tells us that we can't limit ourselves to what is acceptable to corporate politicians who, despite their rhetoric, as Bashkar was saying, ultimately they bow down to the interests of Wall Street. And if we don't want the movement to be limited by that, then we have to go beyond that. And that question comes down to the labor movement as well. I mean, I would say, I'm a member of the AFL-CIO, I'm a member of the Teachers Union in Seattle, and it is shameful the role that Trumka has played in trying to make, compromises, rhetorical compromises in the Trump administration. No, as a matter of fact, what we need is for the labor movement to become, the front and center of the fight against Trump, and really take on a strong position on that, and not only talk about contracts and fair contracts and protecting the unions today. Of course, we have to do that. We have to fight against, the elimination of Davis-Bacon. We have to fight against right to work and so on. But it's not just that. The labor movement also has to play an active role in Black Lives Matter, against police violence, on the question of women's rights, on the question of reproductive rights, and so on. We have to. I think that was partially touched on by Bhaskar when he said that there's a gap between the social struggle itself, where it lies, and the leaders of what this should be. And I think that gap is not just for socialist organizations and where the working class is, but it's also true for the labor movement. And I think that question should be taken into account. I need to stop right now, but just to end, I would say that paramount for us in the next few weeks is to build for May Day, build for a strong May 1st action, talk about the Summer of Resistance, and look beyond that. Pride is coming up, and I think that all indications are that this year Pride will be probably the most politicized and active in many decades. And so we have to actively think about what political demands we're going to raise for the LGBTQ movement in solidarity with them, and use that also as a lever to build the Summer of Resistance.
Okay.
Imperative to win victories. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what you've been able to accomplish so far as a city council person, and also how you've been able to accomplish as much as you have, given that you only have one vote on the city council.
Thank you for asking that question. I think that's very important. I mean, I'm really glad that Bill de Blasio recognizes that we should have Seattle envy. I really welcome the opportunity for us as activists and as socialists to discuss why that is. It's not that Seattle has something unique in the water there that we drink or something like that. It's actual factors on the ground, political factors on the ground that either mean success or failure. And so I think a good starting point is something that Bhaskar said earlier, which is that the end goal isn't if we are in this social struggle, with the idea of transforming society. And then, that's the bare bones assumption that we're talking about non-career type politicians and movements that are genuinely fighting for something. If that's true, if the social struggle is the means to win real social change, then clearly the end goal isn't winning elections. Winning elections is or isn't, that's something we should discuss, but is a way to help build the struggle to win real social change. And what would winning that social change look like? First of all, it would mean winning major reforms under capitalism. It would mean, fighting for full funding of education, single-payer healthcare, real police accountability, all of that. I mean, I don't need to go into that. We know all of the components of that. But as hard as it will be to tackle that, we can't stop there. I think as socialists, we also need to understand that if we are going to address the entrenched oppressions in our society and also, permanently shift society towards a different kind of society, especially in relation to climate change and sustainability, then we also have to talk about systemic change. But regardless of what the goals are, whether it's just winning reforms or fighting for socialism, I think we also have to agree then that we will need an empowered base, a social base, an empowered working class, empowered generation of young people, women, and LGBTQ community. And the reason we need that, the reason we need to build power from below is because we know we're not going to win that social change by asking billionaires nicely or by asking Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer nicely. We know that's not going to happen. So that is why we need to build power from below. And that's the fundamental approach that we used in Seattle when we ran our campaign for city council in 2013. We raised $15 an hour prominently on our campaign banner, not because we had a fetish about it, but because we, through discussion and debate in our organization in Socialist Alternative, we recognized that $15 an hour was going to gain more and more traction in the consciousness of a mass of working people throughout the nation. It was a winnable demand, and that it would really energize ordinary working people to get involved in the campaign and embrace it as their own, so that it could actually start building that base of power. And that was a very key component of our campaign, and I can tell you, every time we talked about $15 an hour, we were laughed at, there was contemptuous reactions because nobody thought it could be done, but that's a starting point. I mean, what kind of campaigns do we run in order to win? That requires looking beyond what is said in corporate media or in conventional discourse, and really studying where mass consciousness is heading. And then after winning the election, as Amelia said, we are just one vote on a city council of 9 council members. We could either have been principled but marginalized and isolated, or we could have integrated into the corporate democratic establishment and have betrayed the interests of working people. But in the 3.5 years that we've been on the council, we have done neither. Neither have we been marginalized, nor have we betrayed the interest. The way we have done of the working class, and the way we have done that is by mobilizing and empowering a real social base. And obviously it's still small. I don't think that Socialist Alternative in a small city is the end. It's just an example of what can be done. And secondly, and I think in some ways this is more important because this doesn't get talked about, is employing tactics and strategies that have succeeded in outwitting the Seattle political establishment. And in all honesty, we have to recognize the Seattle's democratic establishment is very powerful. We should not have delusions of grandeur. The question to ask is, how is it, despite that, we have won these victories and not got marginalized? And there, building the social base, using the council seat to really empower working people and use it as a platform has been a good example. But along with that, and this is what doesn't get talked about, is tactics and strategies. And there I would say having Socialist Alternative as my own organization, a political organization that thinks of tactics and strategies independently of the Democratic Party, independent of the labor leadership, was absolutely crucial, not incidental or nice, but crucial to winning $15 an hour. Just to give you a very small example, during the 15 struggle, there was there was a whole question of tactics, obviously, all along the road. But one very important tactic was what Socialist Alternative used through using our council office was filing a ballot initiative, in other words, a referendum, as a threat, a credible threat against the establishment, saying that if you don't pass a $15 an hour on the council, we will be going to the voters. And that was a scary prospect to the establishment. And that was a tactic that had a true difference of opinion between me and the other labor leaders who were represented in that committee of the mayor that was fighting on $15 an hour. And the rest of the members of the committee were big business, by the way, who were fighting against 15. And so, why do I say that Socialist Alternative was key? Because even if I was the most brilliant person in the world, which I'm not, and I came up with these brilliant tactics, there is no possibility of actually acting on those tactics and pushing the struggle in that direction without an organization that agrees on those tactics in a mass way, and all members, all out. Patrick was part of that, and also using that organization as a starting point to talk to a greater mass of people, winning their trust on it, by building the 15 Now campaign. And that tactic is a very key example of how we would not have won 15 without that. And the reason I can tell you with so much confidence is that after we won $15 an hour, we have it straight from the horse's mouth. Both the Chamber of Commerce and the mayor, who's a corporate politician, said if there wasn't that threat of the ballot initiative, I don't think we would have given in. And it was only Socialist Alternative, through having our office in City Council, through Building 15 Now, that was able to push for a key, a really key way in which we were able to win it. And that's just one example. I could give you a lot.
All right.
Follow up to Bashkar, what lessons from Seattle do you think might be useful for the socialist movement here in New York City and elsewhere? And besides Seattle, are there other examples that are informative for socialists like that?
I would say that the main lesson from Seattle is that you can and should run as an open socialist. And beyond that, if you're organized as a socialist current, if you're open about being a socialist, and if you're simultaneously pushing for demands like $50 minimum wage that have popular resonance, then left liberals will join and follow you. Not just individual left liberals, but even left liberal politicians. So I think there's a tendency, a kind of like fake pseudo-realism that says, in order to be relevant, we can't offend, or we have to at least follow the lead from some of the least odious people among kind of democratic elected officials. And I would agree with that to the simple extent that, I think we should probably primary, 200 other Democrats, the national level before we get to like Elizabeth Warren and Sherrod Brown. But I think the problem with that fake realism is it essentially just subordinates socialists to being just very, very progressive, to being just like the shock troops or the most dependable people for these broader campaigns. And I think even when it has achieved some gains, I think it's been limited in its horizons and what it leaves in a kind of lasting way, particularly with the Working Families Party in New York that has won some real gains, but still, the project has been kind of stifled and limited. So I think the lesson of Seattle is that if you push your own politics and you push your own initiatives, then you'll be providing, for lack of a better word, like leadership for left liberals and others who either through a combination of opportunistically seeing that this is politics that has popular resonance and will work, or in fact, due to their real convictions, would follow kind of the lead. So I think that's the key lessons, to kind of be open about being socialist. And that doesn't mean being sectarian, because obviously you're working in broad fronts, you're speaking to popular demands, but I think it does mean a shift from the politics that was pushed by a lot of the left in the 70s, 80s, 90s, DSA included, but the CP, other groups that said both in the electoral realm we need to work with closely hand in hand with groups like the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Then also in the sphere of trade unions, we need to simply do nothing else than elect left leaderships and encourage them to seek alliances with more centrist figures in the union to guard against the right. And again, in certain periods, one could say that this tactic could, prevent, further onslaughts or cuts or whatnot. But I think we've seen in the long run the position that it puts in the left. So I think Seattle provides, at least broadly, a model for an offensive left, a left able to push demands, even if the broader national climate would seem to be, a purely defensive one.
Now we have a question for both of you. You both support the idea of building a mass socialist party with deep roots in the working class. What are the main challenges and obstacles you see that would need to be overcome to make that a reality? Either of you want to go first?
Yeah, sure.
And can we just try and keep these answers to 3 minutes to keep?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's as simple as saying that there's just not the level of class struggle right now that can sustain a real mass party. And obviously, you could say it's a chicken or the egg thing, or you can't just conjure struggle out of anything. But I would put it, this way: like, what would a workers' party look like in the United States today? Okay, then if it's composed by the current labor movement and it's just a capital L labor party, then like on what basis would you actually try to convince labor leaders and others to break from the Democratic Party and try their own thing? You couldn't unless there was like very different background conditions. It wouldn't exist. There would have to be turmoil within the unions. There would have to be huge influxes of rank and file struggles. There would have to be people out in the streets. It would have to look very, very different. And this isn't necessarily for bad reasons. When I keep talking about the labor bureaucracy, I'm not talking about people with necessarily bad intentions. I am talking about people engaging in transactional politics, and not always for bad reasons, right? They're engaging in transactional politics because a couple percentage points in a contract or the defense of a pension might make the difference for their members between living in poverty and living stable, happy lives. So I'm not moralizing. Now, so I think of the idea of building a mass socialist party as kind of a distant hope. I do think that it is a prerequisite for pushing more radical reforms. It's a prerequisite for changing the country. So I think it should be very much at the center of our political vision. I think we should reject kind of the visions of the post-party left or people that think it's that parties by nature are going to just become purely electoralist or reformist or whatnot. I mean, I think politics within these parties prevent it. But I think that's the necessary part. And I think it's also important to kind of break down the question. We say that there's a difference between building a socialist party and building a workers' party that is socialist, and building a labor party. I think they're all kind of different projects. So I can't imagine maybe building on the one end a broad left party that slowly wins support from more and more workers and support from a larger segment of the trade union movement, like the Lincoln model. I could see that. I could see setting up one day a successful labor party, then trying to develop a socialist current within that labor party. I could also see much more tangibly, I think within reach, a project for the next 5-10 years, building a socialist party that will basically just say, let's unite these various socialist groups into kind of a framework that would make our politics more relevant. Maybe that group would have 50,000 people. But again, I don't actually think that, I think in a country of 330 million people, we should question kind of immediately how much that could accomplish. There's a great Lenin has a quote that says something like, "Politics starts in the hundreds of thousands," and I think that kind of applies even more so in the U.S. of 2017 than it did in Russia of 1917.
I agree that it's not a straightforward question, and the process is not going to be straightforward. And I also agree that there's different kinds of questions you could pose on what kind of party you want. There's no question about all of those complications in the terrain. I also think, though, that just fundamentally speaking, in many, many generations, there has never been as propitious or favorable a time as now to begin that project. We don't have to, and we are certainly not going to reach the ultimate goal of what a real workers' party would look like. But if we don't start it, it's not going to take shape, because it's not going to ever take shape in the abstract by reading about it. It's going to be through the actual experience of building an independent force, of working people actually going through that experience of trial and error, experiencing both victories and defeats, drawing lessons from those victories and defeats, that it can go, it can start taking the shape of what a real party that could shift society fundamentally that could happen. So in some ways, I think, Bashkar said it's a chicken and egg. I would say it's a tautology. We need to do it or it won't get done. But that doesn't mean we're going to reach the end point on the first day. We're going to have to start somewhere. And I think that it is not merely a procedural question, and I don't need to state it as a procedural question, like whether we don't need to start it today so that then it can take some form, better form later. It's also, and this is the most paramount question, it's a political question, not a procedural or bureaucratic question. It is a question of offering the correct education to our fellow members of the working class. And I don't believe that running candidates in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party offers that education. And I think that if we look at that as the paramount question, then it does raise the question of, okay, how do we build that independent force? Yes, it is hard, but how do we do it? So there are some starting points that we have the political and moral responsibility to examine. I mean, for example, we have Socialist Alternative, we have DSA, we have other socialist groups. Could we potentially run 10, 20, 30 candidates together, but not just run candidates? I mean, I think we all agree that running for elections is not an end in itself. So it's a question of what kind of campaigns we run. So it's a question of bringing our forces together in a very honest way, not agreeing where we don't actually agree, but laying an honest, united basis for running many candidates on the basis that those candidates will be held accountable through some sort of democratic structure that we will need to build, just like Socialist Alternative has a democratic structure to hold me and other elected officials, internationally, we're part of an international. We have structures that hold all our elected officials accountable. So we will need something like that. We will need for these campaigns and these candidates to pledge to run on an anti-capitalist basis. We will need a concrete program of political demands, obviously starting from the most basic, like $15 an hour, but going up to much higher demands. I would say that if we are talking about raising the vision of the working class towards a question of a real socialist party, then we have to examine the question of running candidates who pledge to run on a truly anti-capitalist basis, meaning in the program of demands of our election campaign, we should also talk about, in addition to $15 an hour and single-payer healthcare and taxing the rich and closing the military budget and so on, we also have to talk about taking the oil lobby into mass democratic public ownership in order to address the question of climate change. We need to, we're going to have to, raise the bar on that question. And I think that as far as what social situation we have available to us today, it is the most open that it has been in many generations. And I would wager that if Sanders was to, rather than doing this speaking tour with Tom Perez that he's planning to do, which I completely disagree with, if it's totally uninspiring. If Sanders was to announce a new party today with democratic structures and a focus on anti-Trump struggle, building a real social base, building power from below, not just elections, I think 50 to 100,000 young people would be immediately interested in that project. Will it be easy? No. But it will be done.
To pivot to a slightly different topic, Bashkar, as an editor of a rapidly growing socialist magazine, what role do you see for Jacobin and social media in general in the Trump era?
Yeah, so I think that the task of a socialist publication doesn't change a whole lot depending on who's in power or whatnot. I would say that initially when I started Jacobin, it was almost over 6 years ago. I kind of didn't foresee the possibility of even semi-mass socialist politics in my lifetime. And that sounds kind of depressing, but kind of the way that I saw it was as a way to kind of keep alive ideas and accumulated kind of like knowledge and discussion about strategy and kind of broadly a tradition. Obviously not just for the sake of keeping alive a set of ideas or a subculture, but as a way to kind of put those ideas into action one day. And I think it seems hopeful with the way things are going that these ideas are now going to be relevant, sooner, more soon than kind of expected. But I think one of our goals was kind of like challenging, and I think this is true of should be true of all social publications, not just Jacobin, is to kind of challenge our readers to see things in like all of its nuance and complexity. So you see venues like this is inopportune. I'm just like I like the Truth Outs of the world, or like some of these other venues which like publish good material at times, but often just kind of speak to already the converted, or kind of stirs outrage and passion around the converted. I think there's room for that agitation, but like if we just had that, we'd be left with a left that just agitates, instead of the old agitate, educate, organize. And I think that's kind of the goal of the socialist publication. So in other words, I want people to read Jacobin. I want them to we're publishing something like 30 articles this year on like the Russian Revolution and history 100 years ago. Read those articles and develop positions on a variety and host of things. But I then use it to become non-sectarian, but non-sectarian by choice. I think there's a difference between kind of wading into an argument on the left and then just saying that this is just useless kind of chatter, or this has no real significance, or why does it matter what we think about Greece when we're here today trying to organize in New York? Then there's having very strong positions and convictions and views, while obviously still being open to other arguments, and then not letting that be a barrier to organizing and working with people who have very different views than you. And I think that's the difference between a social publication and a liberal left one. We don't want to just get people riled up. We want them to kind of see, society in all its complexity, and still be against it. That's kind of that's the difference between being, let's say, anti-enlightenment, like some aspects of the radical left are, and being kind of in favor of this kind of like dialectical enlightenment, right? Like that's the difference between being a socialist and being just a radical.
And Kshama, for you on the media, obviously the corporate media is very hostile to socialists. They're quite hostile, or often ignore Bernie Sanders. So how have you dealt with the media? How have you combated with the hostility of the corporate media? What strategies have you guys used?
Thanks. I first wanted to say that I really appreciated what Bashkar said about the difference between a socialist publication and other left liberal publications. And there's no doubt that Jacobin is performing an incredible service for thinking. And it's really important. It's not just about agitation. It's about analyzing the political situations, also historical study, because there are so many lessons that can be drawn out for and translate it into today's context. I think that's incredibly important. And so, before I go into how we dealt with media issues in Seattle in the context of our council seat and so on, nationally, we do put a lot of emphasis on developing our newspaper, and internationally also, it's an important focus of our work to develop analytical articles and really understand the situation as opposed to just as you saying, get people riled up, although that's a prerequisite. If you're not riled up, then you're not going to want to read our analysis. But as far as in Seattle, it's true. I mean, but what happened with Bernie Sanders is a very good example of what will happen if we have real fighters that get on the center stage, because the corporate media, I mean, there's all kinds of, you can't just, it's not as simple as just saying corporate media. There's lots of actual reporters and journalists who try to do a valiant job despite all that. But on the whole, it is not a favorable terrain for us. And that's true in Seattle as well. We just saw it on a national stage with Bernie Sanders. And the way we have combated that is by looking at it not in terms of, what can we do to get into the media, but rather, what can we do to reach the people we are trying to reach. And so when we look at it that way, it has meant for us that we have put in a lot of resources, a lot of thinking, a lot of organization, like political thinking and organization around actually building a base of socialists in Seattle who go door to door to a lot of the working people and young people who we know are interested in our ideas and want to go beyond that, want to get involved in the campaigns that we have built. I mean, that is how we build some really incredible campaigns. When we joined the movement to force the mayor and the corporate city council members who wanted to push for a new police bunker, police precinct. And actually, by the way, it was the two Latinas on the council who pushed for it. And that's also a lesson for us that we have to look at who are the representatives that actually stand on our side. And it's not about what they look like; it's about which position they take. But anyway, when we fought against the bunker, we didn't stop there. We translated it into a Build 1,000 Homes campaign, and the reason we were able to do that was because we had already spent at least 2 or 3 years going door to door in a very systematic campaign, especially during the election and re-election, really understanding what people are saying, what people are thinking, and it was very clear to us that affordable housing is absolutely the most potent question on people's minds. But the reason we know that is because we systematically do that kind of, it's not a question of data collection, it's a question of politically reaching people, drawing their thoughts out, and then offering our program, saying, hey, this is what we're doing to fight it, will you join us? I think that kind of work has a lot of potential in New York as well. I know New York is much bigger than Seattle, but we also have SA, and DSA, I believe, has 2,000 members here. I think there's potential. If we ran campaigns in New York jointly, we could actually build that kind of thing. And as a matter of fact, in Seattle, we even built what we call an emergency response network during our re-election campaign, because we had a lot of, false news about me personally or about our city council office coming out in the media, and we had a whole political machine that would have responses, drafted and printed, and then we would actually go door to door to everybody. And then the last thing I will say, in terms of how you push back against a whole establishment infrastructure that is pitted against you, is also how you deal with, how we have our candidates deal with the questions that come at us. And just one quick example I wanted to give you is that the Stranger newspaper, which has been, it has undergone many shifts and it's moving to the right a little bit right now, but it has been the leftmost publication. It's a publication that is attractive to young people who are really thinking politically and so on. And that publication gave us a huge boost in 2013, and it was one of the critical factors that helped us win. But the reason we won that endorsement was not because they agreed with our politics. They were extremely uneasy with our politics, and they during the endorsement interview they kept saying things like, "You're too extreme. You're one of those socialists. One of those socialists," meaning we actually have a political program away from capitalism. They find that strange. But the point is that for us as socialists and as socialist activists, it is extremely critical that we master the political terrain that is in front of us. And so the reason we won their endorsement and their respect, grudging respect, not because they agreed with us politically, but because we had better answers to the nitty-gritty of the policy questions in Seattle than did the Democratic opponents. And when you do that, you basically, that's half the battle won, because then they don't get the excuse to say, well, you don't know what's happening in Seattle. So I would say that a realistic component of building our own profile, despite the media airing against us, is to master those things and then move forward. So it's like it's a way of sort of beating back on obstacles.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to get to questions from the audience in just a second, but first we have a really important announcement, which is we need your help paying for this event. The socialist movement is not rich. We don't have rich backers. We don't have CEOs giving us money, etc. And the cost of this meeting for Kshama's ticket, her plane ticket here, and also for the room are quite high. So if everyone here was to give about $8, I think we might be able to recover our cost. Actually, that's not correct. I can't do math, so forget that. But there's orange buckets. Can we have some people pass these buckets around, and just people can donate what they can to help us cover the cost? That would be fantastic. And we also have one announcement.
Comrades, are you guys ready to strike on May Day? Woo! Are you ready to strike on May Day? Yeah! And there's 375 workers at B&H Warehouse who are going on strike on May 1st, and it's going to be at 9th Avenue and 34th Street. Are you going to come and stand in solidarity with these workers? Yes?
I don't think that's right. You're going to sit up and pick a line, you're going to stand up. Come on. Union, power. When I say union, you say power. Union, power. Union, power. Union, power. It's 10 a.m., 34th Street, 9th Avenue, B&H.
Okay.
And there's also a picket line tomorrow, 3 to 5,
Okay.
Friday the 28th.
Oh yeah, Friday the 28th at noon to 2. And then TSA is rallying at Union Square on May 1st at 4 p.m. We're joining the rally at 4:30, Socialist Alternative. We would love you guys to march alongside us. Thanks.
Thank you.
I really owns that.
So the way this is going to work is we're going to take 4 questions at a time really quick. So we just see some hands who want to ask a question. How about John, the woman in glasses, and then Alyssa, our timekeeper. And how about you? I'm sorry, what's your name? Brian. And so Kelly will have the microphone. If people could just come up here all at once and just quickly ask your question.
Hi, thanks very much. Just a couple points from Seattle. I wanted to ask two different questions. One is an electoral question. In Kshama's victories, we were in a top 2 primary system. So we had 4 candidates at one point. I'm not sure of the number. In the primary, got through the primary, and there was only one candidate to campaign against. And I wonder if that's a factor, if the electoral system is a problem here in New York. And the other question was about alliances. In the victories that we've had in Seattle, almost all of them have been unanimous or nearly unanimous votes where the corporate council members voted against their constituents. And I'm wondering whether the alliances that were formed outside of socialist alternatives around the issues was an important factor in changing our legislation.
Okay. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, extra loud. Okay. Please talk about bathroom bills and attacks on trans people and how you see socialists particularly intervening and standing in solidarity with these fights as they become more sharp over time, and they are. So, okay.
Councilwoman Sawant, you recognize the possibility for education through political organization. And I wonder from both of you if you think there is a kind of substantial or material difference in education through organizing for a political organization versus organizing for a party. And then also, what kind of risk do you think there is of losing organizers to the Democratic Party out of fear or lesser evilism?
Hey, how you guys doing? So, my question is about language, and it's in particular with the working class, because I feel like very Republicanist, wins come into people that are in the working class and are struggling. And why would they look to them? Yet, when isn't it ironic? Socialists, we're claiming to be that cause. Yet, I feel like it's our language that isn't connecting with them, and that do you feel that we're not connecting with them? Do you feel that you're using the correct language, or that it's our failure to get it across people that don't read Noam Chomsky? They don't read Howard Zinn. They don't read that. They swing a hammer and come home and hope they put enough food on the table for the family. And that's what they care about.
Okay. How long for these answers?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just take a couple of the questions. On the question of trans struggle and the bathroom bills in general, I think it's without a doubt, when the Republicans are in power, the right's in power, they're going to, try to score points by picking the most reactionary fights possible until they encounter enough resistance that they fold. So 10 years ago, it was a more generalized attack on gay and lesbian people, and now, even a lot of mainstream Republicans are changing their tune because they see kind of the force and power of resistance. So it wasn't, it wasn't the Human Rights Campaign and other elite lobbying efforts. It really had to do with mobilization. So I think the key and the particular role of socialists is just to be the best and most militant, people in struggles against oppression, but also to add kind of a class dimension to this understanding. So, in New York, I think when Cuomo pushed his, finally changed his tune and allowed gay marriage in New York, that was just a couple weeks after a budget in which shelters were cut, including shelters that disproportionately served youth who were disproportionately gay, lesbian, and trans. So this is kind of like the arguments and things that socialists were bringing up and calling to attention that you weren't getting from just the general progressives. As far as the question of language, I agree, but I would add the caveat that I think it's important to remember the reason why the left is historically weak in the United States, which we are given the size and scope of the United States and compared to the size of the left, is because capital's historically strong. We're going up against the most brutal, most coherent, everything else, ruling class, and as a result, the left has suffered a series of defeats over the course of years and years and years, which have left a legacy. And one of those legacies is that, from many years, socialism was almost on the verge of being like a subculture, right? It was almost on the verge of being just not relevant to people's experience and just kind of people reading or talking or debating or arguing in kind of ones and twos separate from struggle itself. I think the cure to this is struggle. And what I said before was kind of implantation in kind of working class struggle. But I don't think it's something that we could just say that it's a matter of kind of language and approach. I also think we should caution as struggle develops and as people take part in them, ordinary people who haven't been exposed to politics before or just think of politics as just voting every 2 or every 4 years, they will be active participants and they'll want and be the ones developing kind of these ideas and these debates. So I'm also wary of the idea that it's just a matter of kind of rebranding and dropping some language, because I think that if we look at when there's been massive social upheavals around the world, it's been kind of worker intellectuals who've been kind of producing knowledge and engaging in debates that often do get theoretical because they want to change the world in the here and now. I think what's really important though is that again the left get away from kind of just campuses, get away from the university, and get away from just focusing on academia and just develop ideas out of academia. I think there's a lot of neuroses that kind of come from that. Lenin was not an academic. Trotsky was not an academic. Luxembourg, they weren't academics. They were connected to big mass parties. And even if you want a more contemporary example, look at the right. Even the right doesn't draw its intellectuals from academia. They have their own networks of think tanks and NGOs and other things, but it's really just a particular idiosyncrasy of this kind of new left generation that went to academia that I think has further added layers and layers of kind of complex language that I mean, is fundamentally flawed and doesn't speak to social realities, then kind of that it only makes sense if you add convolutions to it. Anyway, that's it.
So just to add to what Bashkar said about fighting on the question of trans rights and LGBTQ rights more broadly, I think it is very, very important and not a side issue, but it's very, very important that we as socialists make the political demands around trans rights, bathroom rights, the question of LGBTQ rights, rights that specifically apply to those who identify as LGBTQ as a central part of our program. It's not as, oh yeah, we also care about your bathroom rights. But no, but presenting it in connection with our class-oriented program, but not as secondary or subsidiary, but as integral, with an understanding that if we are fighting for a socialist society, that society is a society that is going to try to free itself of all oppression. And we're not going to be able to free ourselves of all oppression unless we stand with all oppressed people today, and that is not by just having an absent-minded view about it, but adopting it as a central issue for ourselves, and connecting it to the class demands as well, and recognizing and pointing out that it's no coincidence that if you look at the statistics of poverty, homelessness, sexual abuse, discrimination in the workplace, workplace harassment, it is no coincidence that women suffer more, LGBTQ people suffer more, trans people suffer more. So saying that not only do we as non-trans people have an obligation to fight with trans people because we won't be able to achieve that future society that we're fighting for, but also explaining that as somebody who is trans, as LGBTQ, if you're fighting for a society free of oppression, then you also have to recognize that these demands are interconnected and that we're not going to be able to fight unless we actually adopt a class-based program. And that is why, as socialists, we are indeed actually the best equipped to fight for a society that is free of those oppressions and fight on those demands. And I would say concretely, I'll give one example of the future and then one example from what we just did in the past, is that, I mentioned Pride marches this year. I think socialists have to play, and our socialist organizations have to play an integral role in developing political demands for the pride rallies, pride marches, talking about what does it mean for socialists to fight with trans people against Trump's agenda. And that's not just about bathroom bills, it's also talking about workplace harassment, homelessness, single-payer healthcare in order to make sure that the healthcare rights of trans people are guaranteed. And the only program through which trans people's healthcare rights will be guaranteed will be a truly public healthcare system, single-payer healthcare. But connecting all of that, organizing public meetings during Pride, leafletting at Pride for public meetings, inviting people to come to a public meeting to say, how do socialists fight for LGBTQ demands, that sort of thing. And just to give you one concrete example from what we did in the past, 2 years ago, or maybe it's 3 years ago now, using our council office platform, we organized a very, very important, as it turned out, we didn't know it would really take off in this way, but an LGBTQ town hall. And the starting point of that town hall was to address the rise in violence against LGBTQ people, but especially trans people in the neighborhood of Capitol Hill. And Capitol Hill has been historically an LGBTQ activist neighborhood, which is now getting gentrified, and so there's all these tensions between higher income people moving there, and then all the harassment and violence on the streets increasing. So we built this town hall primarily to discuss how would we, as socialist council members, as socialists, how would we fight against violence. But it was interesting that the LGBTQ people, especially trans people who attended that event, themselves said, hey, I want to talk about housing. I want to talk about rent control, because there is no safe haven for me unless I have affordable housing. And so we have to also have the faith that people will reach those conclusions if we provide an avenue, an opening for them to reach a class conclusion, but on the basis that we are with them on every question of oppression and not treating it as something that is beside the point. And just very quickly, on the question of working class and right wing and how do we reach out to them, I really agree with the points that Bashkar made, that it's not so much the language that we use. I think we have to have full confidence. We should, of course, we have to make sure that we're speaking in a way that is accessible to working people as a whole, not those who attend our meetings and study groups. But at the same time, I think we have to understand and have the faith that working people understand the language of class analysis and a program based on class analysis. And just to give you a very quick example, I don't know how many of you saw this Bernie Sanders in Trump country when he went to McDowell County, West Virginia, and he talked to coal miners. It was a televised town hall. It was incredible, the impact that it had on the people there. The moment you start presenting it from a class angle, why don't you have single-payer healthcare? How is it that your communities have just been devastated and decimated by the problem of drugs, joblessness, and just an economic stagnation? And don't we need this? Don't we need that? Don't we need to tax the rich? Don't we need to tax Wall Street? And there was no question that, once you watch that, it's almost magical. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate it. It's going to be, we will need to win them over on the correct basis, which means that we don't give an inch on the question of, social questions like on sexism or racism or xenophobia. We don't give an inch on that, but rather have the confidence that if you could win them over on a class basis, those other ideas will also be shed over time, because they're just proxies. When your community is facing intergenerational poverty and drug addiction and economic decimation, then you're going to blame immigrants, you're going to blame black people, you're going to blame gay people. Instead, tell them you need to blame Wall Street, you need to blame the capitalist class.
Another set of hands. Let's see. Person in the back. Let's see. Woman in the woman in the back. Yes.
Purple
they're
shirt.
purple. Let's see. Anyone else?
Hi, all of us over here. There's a lot of hands. That's
Yeah.
women.
All right. Can I have the woman with the flannel, please? And then anyone else? Yes. Person is the black with the sweatshirt. You guys can come up. Yes, please come on up. There's Mike.
If everyone can come up right now.
One. Oh. Yeah.
Kshama, you addressed, you addressed the language issue and education on the left and connecting with the working class. But my question is, how do we win over the educated urban liberal? The group that is salaried, they believe in social, they show up for social issues, they march for science, they march for women's rights, and they march for gay rights, but they don't really show up for mating. How do we bridge the gap with that group? Thank you.
Hi, good evening, thanks. I had a question regarding marijuana, and as far as I remember, it won everywhere was on the ballot except Arizona. And I was wondering also about Seattle, with disproportionate rates of possession charges of people of color. They ran that and got rid of all the possession charges, and has it helped with policing of community of color? More trust now? Does it help? And what we do in order to put things on the ballot? It's like non-profit co-ops that want to sell agricultural cooperatives that sell marijuana as a commercial tool of the business.
Hi, I was wondering how could parties like the Socialist Alternative get more people elected on the local level in traditional red states where there may not even be a Democrat?
Okay, how much time is it for a question? A minute. I would like to give an answer instead of a question, just in 1 minute.
I think we're really asking people to frame it as a question.
If the body allows for one answer, I'm a communist and a Trotskyist, and I have some comments to make. So that's okay.
Come up with a
One
question,
thing I
Ma.
want to say,
What?
I'm with the Spartacus League. That's fine. You can laugh. Here we are, still standing. Show some respect. I have 1 minute, and I want to use it just to say that it's disgusting to hear that a so-called, alternative is Bernie Sanders. This is an imperialist Democrat. So can we just cut through this crap? And I want to say something interesting, which is that you mentioned Luxembourg. Well, you know what? Your comrades from the German Social Democrats were the people that murdered Luxembourg and Liebknecht. So maybe you can answer that. Maybe you can develop. I don't know how much time do I have left. But the
20
fight for
seconds,
black
ma'am.
rights, the fight for black liberation in this country is a key issue. And there was nothing put forward here. So if you're interested in looking for a Trotskyist program about the expropriation of the means of production and cut through this thing about electoral politics, Socialist Alternative, the police are workers in uniform. How do you like that? How about police reform and all the things you push? Why don't we talk about those issues?
Talking about the best ways to reach out to educated urban liberals, whether marijuana legalization has had an impact on policing communities.
No.
Something you can't read my notes on, so. Oh yes, parties in red states and did you kill person?
All right. Okay, so you repeated the question. I took notes. I can't really read my notes either. So excuse me if I missed some of the questions. I think on the question of marijuana legalization or decriminalization, I think the key issue for socialists has to be, first and foremost, framed around this issue of the way in which drug possession charges plague working class people, the way in which it feeds into the U.S. Police state and incarceration on these issues. I'm less interested in kind of what mechanisms for like cooperative growing or selling or whatever. I mean, I think this is just kind of different forms of, either marijuana is going to become like big business and be like tobacco, companies are going to just diversify into marijuana or something similar, or it's going to become kind of small, petty bourgeois commerce. I think that's an inevitability within capitalism, especially if it's legal. I'm not necessarily against the latter, but I think that's less of a kind of, the details of that are less interesting to me, though I share the idea that they should be obviously there should be immediate decriminalization and legalization. Now, as far as the question of how to win over educated urban liberals, I mean, again, it depends. It really just depends on kind of the class background of these people. I always think we could win over 15% of anyone, like anyone. If W has 100, sorry, I keep returning to W. If he has 100 cousins, we might, at the peak of class struggle, win over 10 or 15 of them. The KGB did a great job recruiting, spies out of Cambridge. But, so 15% sure on pure moral and ethical appeals. But I think fundamentally, our core message to people as we organize, as we grow as social science, will be around people's day-to-day needs. Will be around kind of winning over them to a broader vision of politics and showing the way in which this vision of politics is in their interests and the interests of their family, having them as active participants as this politics grows and develops. And we still won't win over 100% of those people, we'll win over 60. That's my coalition. That's my 50-state strategy. 60% of the working class won over, plus 15% of the George W. Bush family. Now, I guess the last question wasn't really a question, but I should say, it's important to note, there was the SPD, there was the KPD, but then there was the long, poor, forgotten by history USPD. So at worst, they just kind of sat by and didn't do enough, but they did not kill Rosa.
By the way, I support you on the on the marijuana question, I don't have that much more to add. I don't have much expertise on that at all. I don't know if there's been an immediate drop in the disproportionate rate of arrests of people of color. It's certainly a very important question to ask. I really agree with Bashkar that should happen. And I would say that, let me just speak about it in more general terms, that ultimately I think, especially on such gnarly questions as racism and police violence and disproportionately directed at people of color and especially black and brown youth, I think I would say, without knowing the real statistics on the marijuana question after the marijuana legalization in Washington State, I would say that ultimately it will require us to think more deeply and really fight in a much broader based struggle for police reform, for police accountability, for a real democratically elected police oversight bodies in our metropolitan areas that can actually hold the whole police system accountable. And I don't think this is an easy task to achieve. But what I am saying is that I don't believe that passing more liberal laws, which I think is important, we have to fight for it, and socialist alternatives supported the marijuana legalization. I'm just saying that I don't think it's going to be enough to pass those laws. I don't imagine that you would see a sweeping change in society just based on that. It will really require a social struggle. We cannot really look for shortcuts. And I'm not trying to imply that the speaker who asked the question is saying that. I'm just saying in general, we cannot look at legal means as shortcuts for social change. There is no alternative but to really build a social struggle, whether we're talking about the rights of black people or women's rights or workplace rights. There was another question about what about more well-off working people, groups that are high salary, they don't show up on May Day, but they may show up at the Women's March. And I think they showed up in large numbers at the Women's March. I really agree with, Bashkar had a very clever, witty way of saying, which I wish I could have, that 16% versus 15%. But overall, the point being that socialists talk about working class people not as a fetish, but because we see through our experience of our organizing right now and also through historical examples that it is the class that has the most at stake to change society, and it is the class that is the most, sort of amenable to getting organized. And so that is why we focus on it. That doesn't mean we don't focus on working people who are much better off, like doctors, engineers, and so on. But I don't think that we should be preoccupied with that. But having said that, we should also not lose opportunities when we do have a platform to speak to them. And just to give you one concrete example, I come from the very well-off, so-called model minority South Asian community. I used to be an engineer. Most of my friends before I joined Socialist Alternative were engineers, doctors, and just a very, very sort of very select society, section of society. And when I joined Socialist Alternative, they were quite, they felt it was quite strange. They didn't know what to make of it. Just to give you an incident in my life, shortly after I joined Socialist Alternative, I was just walking on the sidewalk on Capitol Hill in my neighborhood where I live. One of my friends was driving by, and she, stopped there in her car and said, "Hey, Kshama, I heard you became some kind of socialist." And I don't know if I'm conveying what I'm trying to convey, which is that they just didn't know what to make of it. There was a distance between us. Friendships dropped off. But conditions change. Things are not static. And I don't want to exaggerate it, but things happen. So you all know that a South Asian engineer was killed by a right-wing bigot in Kansas. Suddenly, it became an immediate question. Fighting against Trump became an immediate question for the South Asian, well-off Google, Microsoft, Facebook kind of community. And they had a rally of 500 people that they invited me to. And I went there trepidatiously, almost deciding to not go because I didn't want I wanted to make a convenient decision to not face their condescension. It's hard. It's hard when you have to face that. You would much rather be among people who agree with you. But I forced myself to go to that, and the reception I got was completely different because their consciousness is starting to shift. And I thought that when I would say, "Hey, as Indians, let's reject the idea of model minority because it's a poisonous idea, and let's fight together with Latino people, with Black people," I thought I would be greeted by a wall of silence. Instead, it was immediately taken up. Now, are they all going to now march with and go on strike? No, they're not. But still, it's a shift, and that those shifts will continue to happen, and we have to exploit those shifts as much as we can, while understanding that that's not our primary focus.
So the last part is we're just going to ask each of our speakers to ask the other one their own question. So who wants to go first?
So let's see. I was given fair warning. I was.
Oh, shit.
So I guess my question relates to this broader question of how our tactics should shift based on different cities or different situations. So west of the Mississippi, basically every single local race is nonpartisan. And in total, maybe 75, 80% of the country's local races are nonpartisan. This was a shock to me. I grew up, in New York, like most of my friends from the Northeast. So, this is a complete shock to me. Everything's deeply partisan races here. So did your tactics shift because you were able to run as an open socialist, but you weren't kind of requiring lifelong Democrats to kind of make the leap and vote on a different ballot line? And how did this compare to other social alternative experiences running in, I guess, partisan races? And I guess Boston was partisan, Minneapolis. Maybe they aren't, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. And it's true, the local races in Seattle are nonpartisan, as you said. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the people who, first of all, most of the people in Seattle are Democratic voters, and I don't think that they are socialists. I mean, at the end of the day, almost 95,000 people voted for us in 2013. I have no illusion that most of them are socialists. They're all Democratic Party voters. But a lot of the people who agreed with with the program we were running on, which is $15 an hour, tax the rich, and so on, rent control, make big developers pay. They I think, genuinely felt that we shouldn't rock the boat more than necessary. You know, they said it's a nonpartisan race. You don't have to say you're a socialist. You don't have to say it at all. Just be quiet about it and just talk about $15 an hour and so on. And certainly that's one way to go. And it may be tempting in some ways because you're sort of taking on more of a challenge when you say, I'm a socialist. I'm a member of Socialist Alternative. I am not a Democrat, and I don't think that running in the Democratic Party will help. You don't have to say it in nonpartisan races. But we chose not to duck that question in that way, even though it would have been convenient for us, for a couple of reasons. One is that I think we have to think of building a strategy or a model that can work in general, because if we say that we're not going to talk about socialism in nonpartisan races, then it also raises questions of what are we going to run as socialists, where it's difficult terrain, or where we will be a spoiler, and so on. So there's a lot of interconnected questions where I think the danger with framing it too specifically, like we'll run socialist candidates only in these conditions, it's a little bit dangerous to say that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't strategize and run in the best possible cases. Obviously, we need to conserve our resources and use them in the most strategic way possible. But at the same time, I think we have to confront the question that if we're going to actually build a mass socialist party or a mass workers' party, it's going to have to go through those stages where we may be a spoiler at one time or another, and so on and so forth. And so we didn't want to duck that question in a very simple way. The other thing was that we also wanted to test it out. What is the response of working people when we say, I am a socialist, I'm a member of Socialist Alternative, I'm not a Democrat? Although it seemed counterintuitive to a lot of the political pundits at that time, we got a very strong reception precisely because we identified ourselves away from the corporate structures that people are sick and tired of. But they don't want to hear that we are. And so I would say that I certainly would not claim, and I don't think we should make the mistake of claiming that campaigns that we run, whether electoral or otherwise, can be carbon copies of one another. I think we have to be very careful to plot out our strategies and tactics and our program depending on what conditions there are. And this goes to the question that was asked earlier also, like how would we as socialists run in the South? I think we can run. But it's a question of what program we would raise there. It's not going to be a carbon copy of what we did in Seattle, because it has to be faced. The consciousness is different. But within that context, how would we run? That's the question we would ask. But having said that, overall, I think we should recognize, and I think if we don't recognize it, it's at our own peril, we should recognize that there is a huge opening for providing a vision and an alternative away from corporate politics. And that is what people want. And as a matter of fact, at the end of the day, even though we did not use the easy choice of nonpartisan and we ended up calling ourselves socialists, at the end of the day, one of the things that helped us win in 2013 was a whole group of Democratic Party activists, like grassroots activists, who do the legislative district work and so on. They formed their own group called Democrats for Sawant. They held their press events and said, I've worked in the Democratic Party for 30 years. This is the first campaign that really speaks to my values, and that's why we're fighting for it. And I don't care if you search. And this question is somewhat related. I'm sure you all have heard that there were some key victories that DSA was able to achieve, electoral victories recently. I hope I'm saying these names correctly. Khalid Kumau in South in Georgia, and Dylan Parker in Rock Island, Illinois. These are both 16 county victories. These are both decisive victories. There were 67 or 68% each of them. They won that much of a vote. It's really huge. So I was really curious to know what Bashkar thinks. So now that we've won these victories, what are the next steps? What are the kind of demands these two council members you think should? I'm not necessarily saying you should know what they're going to do, but what do you think they should do, and how should they fight on those demands, and how building movements in the streets and so on?
All right. I'm more of like DSA is like digital marketing advisor. So I can't speak to broad strategy. I would say that DSA members have been elected. In these two instances, another instance, but they've been elected as kind of individual members. I think there is a difference between there's a difference between like a hard endorsement and a soft endorsement. There's a difference between kind of DSA kind of mobilizing some people to do some phone banks, and there's a difference between making a political campaign kind of the central part of a deep long-term strategy of organizing. And I think in many ways, the latter is more fruitful and more the way that I envision socialist organizations should use electoral campaigns, in which case I think social alternative is a good model. So, I think part of it is once, let's say in this, so in other words, I think it's a good thing these people were elected. I think they're going to be better than almost anyone else that could have possibly gotten elected there. I think they're DSA members who've gotten elected as opposed to a DSA in some capacity holding that position. And I think what's important, why that's important is because I think if we imagine a scenario where a group like DSA would hold like a city council seat, let's say in New York, I would imagine that city council person should be very dependent, at the very least, on that DSA local as far as decision making over their priorities and whatnot. Obviously, there needs to be some balance. They need the flexibility to serve their constituents, and so it's not seen that they're conserving this organization over their constituents and whatnot. There obviously needs to be a degree of national oversight, but at the same time, the local needs a flexibility to respond to local conditions and so on. There's all these complex questions. Luckily, it's very new for us in the United States, but there is, or new in recent decades in the U.S., but there's all, a long legacy of history of people grappling through how to structure these things and whatnot. So fundamentally, not to mince words, I think that it's impossible to avoid some form of democratic centralism. Not the mean, scary, kind of bad form, but just simply to say that we need to have kind of a full, free, diverse discussion, but some degree of unity and action, especially as it relates to elected officials. So in other words, there's going to be a whole host of things where they should be free to really make their own voice, but there should be other decisions onto which they should be subjected to very vigorous discussion within and outside the organization. And essentially then be truly DSA representatives. I think for now, these candidates are not. So I still applaud their victory. I would also say that now that I believe the members of the Spartacus League has left, and I could bring up the fact that David Dinkins, where did he get his political start? David Dinkins was a DSA member. Throughout the 80s, local DSA groups in New York and the general DSA kind of machine, as it were, helped Dinkins along. Obviously, got a lot more help. Obviously, he had other networks and whatnot that helped propel him. And then he became mayor, and of course, tens of thousands of civil servants were laid off under his watch. DSA has a long experience of kind of pursuing an institutionalist kind of approach to working with the liberal left, that I think we should examine that history and that pitfalls. I say that as someone who, my main intellectual kind of inspiration is Michael Harrington. I brought Irving Howe with me to Cuba last month. I'm not saying this in a sort of really derogatory way. I'm just saying there's a host of history and kind of experience of elected officials using not being socialists in their heart, but that just meaning that every night at home they're praying to the altar of socialism. But in their day-to-day practice, they're under real pressures. They're under pressure from both their constituents and from power blocks in the city and from alternative machines. In a way, a social organization needs to be another contending and more powerful pressure to kind of keep them honest, and that's how we avoid electoralism. The same goes for the way in which trade union officials that happen to also be socialists or members of organizations like DSA or social alternative, I think it's very much okay to have union staffers and others involved, but we should be clear about the distinctions between, a union being kind of run by a couple leaders who happen to, in their personal kind of beliefs, be socialist, and a rank and file union, espousing and believing in this kind of thing. And I think the latter is much more promising. Again, as another kind of cautionary tale, in the 80s, young democratic socialists were essentially kind of a recruiting mill for the union staffers and people moving into those kind of arrangements.
Mm.
And a lot of those strategies were maybe seemingly defensible in the late 1970s, when there was, at least notionally the possibility of this kind of liberal left coalition, and there was things like that Humphrey Hawkins full employment, plan being proposed. But I think even more so now than then, even though it was obviously flawed then too, it's really a dead end. So we need to deal with all these things. That was a perhaps too candid response, but yeah.
Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to take a picture together. If you don't want to be in the picture, you don't have to be in the picture. But the reason we're going to take a picture is because on Monday there are a series of trials that are beginning in Ireland, where activists, anti-austerity activists, are being put on trial. Some are being put on trial for a charge of false imprisonment, which is for a protest, a sit-down protest, where they blocked a government minister's car for 2.5 hours. But the charge carries up with it a maximum sentence of a lifetime in prison. And so this protest happened at the height of an anti-austerity movement in Ireland, where the movement was fighting back against water charges that were being added on to taxes that were already paying for water, and they won. So this is basically a criminalization of protest. It's being used to help implement the agenda of austerity. And even more insidious is one of the people on trial is a member of Parliament of the Irish Parliament, which is called the Dáil, Paul Murphy, who's a member of the Socialist Party, our sister organization, part of the Committee for Workers International. So the way we want to do this, maybe Landry, could you take the picture?
My boyfriend will take it.
Okay, great. If we can just gather around in the front over here, we can take the picture from up there. Oh, Leon has the camera. Okay, great.
Oh, how?
So,
Okay.
I have signs.
I'm gonna stop
We
this
have
now.
signs.